The summer of 2017 was supposed to be a simple road trip. My friends and I, Jake and Maria, all recent college grads, wanted one last adventure before the real world swallowed us whole. We planned to drive through the Southwest, hitting iconic spots, the Grand Canyon, Joshua Tree, and some lesser-known desert towns. We rented an old camper van from a shady guy in Phoenix and loaded it with camping gear, snacks, and music playlists to last the whole trip. And our third day on the road was when things started to go wrong. We left Joshua Tree early, aiming to cross the Mojave Desert to reach a small town called Amboy in California. Amboy was basically a blink-and-you-miss-it place, famous for Roy's Motel and Cafe, an old Route 66 landmark. We wanted to camp nearby and maybe snap some photos of the desolate, rusted gas pumps. The sun was brutal and the air shimmered above the blacktop as we rolled past dry washes and brittle scrub. By mid-afternoon, we had to stop at a gas station in a tiny settlement called Essex, basically just a gas pump and a dusty convenience store. The place smelled of stale coffee and diesel. The attendant was an older man, eyes sunken and wary, who warned us not to stay out too late in the desert. "Things get real quiet out there. Too quiet," he said, handing me a free map that looked like it had been folded 1,000 times. We laughed it off, but the unease lingered. That night, we parked the camper near Amboy, a few hundred yards from Roy's Motel. The neon sign flickered weakly against the darkening sky. After a late dinner, we made a small campfire and passed around beers, watching the stars blink to life. Maria complained about the silence. "It's like the desert's holding its breath." Jake joked. "Maybe something's watching us." We laughed again, but none of us could shake the feeling we weren't alone. Around midnight, things shifted. The fire sputtered and dimmed, a sudden gust blowing ash into our faces despite the still air. Then, from the shadows beyond the camper, I heard a soft crunching sound like footsteps on gravel. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam outside. Nothing. "Probably a coyote," I said, though my voice cracked. Maria shivered. "That's what I'm scared of." The footsteps came again, slower this time, circling the camper. Jake shushed us. "Guys, you're just hearing things." But the unease grew. Suddenly, a chilling voice whispered my name from the darkness. "Tyler?" I spun toward the voice, heart hammering. "Who's there?" Only silence answered. The fire flared up suddenly, revealing a shadowy figure standing just beyond the firelight, a pale man, thin, eyes too dark to see, wearing tattered clothes that seemed decades old. I blinked. The figure was gone. We scrambled inside the camper, locking doors and windows. The night stretched on with more whispers, footsteps, and shadows just beyond the glass. At one point, the camper's power flickered off entirely, leaving us in blackness except for the stars outside. We huddled close, too scared to speak. By dawn, the desert was still again. We cautiously stepped outside. The ground around the camper was disturbed, footprints in the dust that hadn't been there before, bare, elongated, and oddly spaced. Jake took photos, but the footprints vanished when we showed them to the gas station attendant later. "Desert critters," he said dismissively. But we knew better. We left Amboy as fast as we could, but the feeling stayed with us for weeks. At night, I'd hear whispers calling my name, shadows flickering just out of sight. I never told anyone else about what happened, but sometimes I think about that pale figure watching from the dark, waiting. The desert hides its secrets well. Story. The end. The scorching sun blazed relentlessly over the endless expanse of the Mojave Desert as I pulled off the cracked asphalt onto a narrow dirt road. The air was dry and heavy, carrying the scent of sagebrush and baked earth. My name's Mark, and in the summer of 2016, I took a contract job that was supposed to be routine. Maintenance work on a remote cell tower deep in the desert near a place called Joshua Tree. I was hired by a regional telecom company to perform inspections and repairs at the site. I'd done work like this before, miles from civilization, no cell service except at the tower itself, and long days alone with only the desert for company. I left my small town in Nevada before dawn and made the 3-hour drive across highways, then onto a winding dirt track that twisted through a landscape dotted with brittle Joshua trees, creosote bushes, and red granite outcroppings. The temperature was already climbing as I parked my old pickup near the base of the tower. I unloaded my tools and carried the heavy equipment up the metal ladder, sweat dripping down my back as the metal frame vibrated faintly in the wind. The job was straightforward: inspect the antennas, replace damaged cables, and calibrate the signal boosters. The sun beat down with unforgiving intensity as I worked, and the occasional buzz of cicadas was the only sound in the vast silence. I was used to solitude, but the desert's stillness felt different, almost alive, watching. By late afternoon, the repairs were done. I packed up my gear, making sure everything was secure, and climbed back down. The sky stretched wide and empty, the sun now beginning to sink toward the horizon. I planned to camp overnight near the site, then head back at first light. I set up my tent in the shadow of the tower, away from the road and out of sight. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset, and the desert night became cold and crisp. The stars spilled across the sky in dizzying numbers, far brighter than any city I'd known. It was beautiful and terrifying in its vastness. Around midnight, I was startled awake by a faint scraping noise outside the tent. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate, like claws slowly dragging across rock. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped as suddenly as it began. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap to scan the area. The beam illuminated nothing but dark shadows and the silhouetted skeleton of a Joshua tree. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a fox or a coyote, and went back to sleep. The next morning, as I packed up, I noticed something strange near the edge of my camp. Small piles of stones arranged in crude circles, some topped with bleached animal bones or dried leaves. I hadn't seen them the day before. My heart thudded uncomfortably. I brushed it off. Maybe some local kids or drifters left markers or warnings. I took pictures to show the company, just in case. That day, as I drove down the dirt track toward the highway, I spotted footprints in the dust. Human, bare feet, large and oddly spaced. They didn't match mine or my truck's tires. The prints headed off into the desert, toward the rocky hills, and disappeared near a cluster of jagged boulders. I felt a chill, despite the heat. When I reached a small town at the edge of the desert, I stopped for gas and asked the clerk about strange activity in the area. She gave me a wary look and said locals didn't talk much about the desert after dark. "It's not safe out there alone," she warned. "Some say things wander the hills, shadows that don't belong to any animal." I laughed it off, eager to return to my truck and get out before nightfall. That night, back at camp, the noises returned. The scraping at first, then faint whispers on the wind, soft, indecipherable murmurs that seemed to circle my tent. The temperature dropped sharply, making my breath fog. I shone my flashlight outward, catching fleeting shadows flitting between the rocks. I kept the flare gun close, but didn't fire. I slept fitfully, waking several times to the sensation of eyes watching me from the darkness. The next day, I found more stone circles, larger this time, some arranged in lines pointing toward the horizon. One was centered around a cracked desert tortoise shell, carefully balanced atop the rocks. I knew then I wasn't alone out here. Something was watching, waiting. On the fourth night, I awoke to the sound of footsteps pacing just beyond the tent. I unzipped the flap and peered out. The moonlight revealed a tall, thin figure standing at the edge of camp. No face, just a dark void where features should be. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and it moved with a jerky, unnatural gait. I slammed the tent shut and fired a flare into the sky. The figure vanished instantly. I packed up first light and drove back to civilization, my hands shaking on the wheel. The company dismissed my reports as heat exhaustion and stress, but I know what I saw. The desert holds secrets, old, restless things. Sometimes in the stillness of night, I can still hear that scraping sound just beyond the edge of my hearing, and it chills me to the bone. Story the end. The desert is a place that teaches you humility. That's what Mark always said whenever he came back from his long stretches out west, hauling equipment across the vast, empty landscapes of Arizona and Nevada. He was a seasoned trucker, used to the monotony of the road, the blistering sun, the endless stretches of sand and rock. The desert was nothing new to him, just another challenge, another job. But this trip, the one he took in the late summer of 2017, was different. It changed everything he believed about the desert, about isolation, and about what can lurk in places where no one should be. Mark was scheduled to deliver a load of mining equipment to a small, nearly forgotten mining outpost deep in the Mojave Desert. The place was called Cedar Wash, nothing more than a few rusted trailers and dilapidated sheds, long abandoned by most, except a handful of miners and the occasional trucker who made the haul. The company warned him that communication would be spotty and cell reception was basically non-existent once he hit the dirt roads leading in. The morning he left Phoenix was clear and hot as expected. Mark loaded up the rig, checked his straps, and headed out on the interstate. The traffic thinned as he neared the outskirts of town, the cityscape fading into rolling sand dunes and scrub brush. The highway was smooth, but as he veered off toward the mining roads, the pavement gave way to gravel and packed dirt, the road narrowing and twisting as it disappeared into the desert hills. His rig rumbled along, tires kicking up clouds of red dust. The sun was fierce, beating down relentlessly. Mark's radio crackled faintly with chatter from other drivers, but soon even that faded into static as the truck's electronics lost signal. By mid-afternoon, Mark pulled over at a small rest area to stretch his legs. He stepped out into the brutal heat, the sun burning his skin instantly despite the shade of his wide-brimmed hat. The wind was still, heavy with the scent of dry earth and creosote bushes. It was quiet, almost too quiet. After a quick check of the rig, he climbed back in and drove on, the dirt road becoming rougher, more jagged, flanked by jagged rock formations that cast deep shadows. The GPS was unreliable, flickering with no clear route. Mark relied on old maps and his memory from previous runs. As the sun began to dip low, the desert took on a different character. The temperature dropped sharply, and the once welcoming shadows now looked long and twisted. Mark kept his eyes on the road, but a nagging feeling settled in his chest. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, the rig sputtered. The engine stalled and then died. Mark tried the ignition again, but the truck was silent. He was dead in the middle of nowhere. He grabbed his phone. No signal. The radio was silent. No other vehicles passed on the road. Mark stepped out into the growing dusk. The desert was vast and empty, but the silence was oppressive. He started walking toward a rocky outcrop that looked like it might provide some shelter. As he moved, he heard something, faint at first, almost a whisper carried on the wind. Then came a rhythmic tapping, like a hammer striking stone, echoing off the cliffs. He froze, heart pounding. The sound was coming from behind him, but when he turned, there was nothing but empty desert. The tapping continued, faster now, accompanied by a faint chorus of low murmurs, almost voices, too distant to understand. Mark quickened his pace, but the desert seemed to shift. The landmarks he had passed earlier were gone, replaced by unfamiliar rocks and shadowed canyons. He stumbled into a narrow canyon, walls closing in tight. The temperature plummeted, and a chill ran down his spine. Ahead, a faint glow pulsed, a flickering light like a campfire, but there was no smoke. Mark approached cautiously. Near a cluster of twisted mesquite trees sat an old mining cabin, its windows shattered, walls charred black in places. The tapping stopped. The whispers faded. Mark called out but received no answer. Inside, the air was stale and cold. On the table lay a worn leather journal and a small rusted tin box. He opened the journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was shaky, but legible. It told of a miner named Samuel who had vanished mysteriously, haunted by shadows and strange figures in the desert night. The last entry was a warning. Beware the watchers in the dark. They come with empty eyes and silent feet. Suddenly, the temperature dropped further, and Mark heard footsteps outside, soft, deliberate. He grabbed the tin box and rushed outside. The desert night was alive with movement. Pale figures, gaunt and shadowy, stood just beyond the firelight. Their eyes were empty voids, black and unblinking. Mark stumbled back, heart racing. The figures moved silently, circling the cabin. He ran toward his truck, but the road had vanished, replaced by endless sand dunes. Panic consumed him. He screamed for help, but the desert swallowed his voice. Dawn came, but the sun revealed no sign of the truck or Mark. Days later, a search party found only the journal and the tin box. Never seen again. The desert had claimed him, joining the ranks of the lost, the forgotten. And at night, when the wind is just right, the tapping returns. Story the end. It was the fall of 2019 when I took a freelance job photographing remote desert architecture. I'd left behind my comfortable life in Portland after a rough breakup and was living out of my truck, taking gigs as they came. I just wrapped up a series in southern Utah and was on my way back to California when I got a call from a guy named Everett. He said he was a reclusive artist working on a land-based installation somewhere outside Quartzsite, Arizona, and needed someone to document it. It was good money and sounded interesting enough. He gave me vague directions, told me there wouldn't be any cell service, and that the last 10 miles would be dirt road. I drove south along Highway 95, then veered off on a nameless dirt track just before the sun started to dip. The terrain was rough, all cracked earth and low scrub, the red-orange glow of sunset casting long shadows across everything. I didn't see any buildings, no signs of construction, nothing but desert and silence. I followed the directions Everett had emailed me, handwritten map and coordinates. The sky had turned dusky purple when I finally saw the structure. It was about the size of a small house made of steel panels welded into odd geometric shapes, like a sunken metallic flower. It looked alien against the flat sand. No driveway, no fence, just there, in the middle of nowhere. There was an old trailer parked nearby, weathered aluminum, a crooked antenna on top, and an open canopy rigged with tattered canvas covering rusted tools and buckets of paint. I pulled up and parked next to the trailer. Before I could even kill the engine, the door creaked open and out stepped Everett. He was tall and lanky, maybe mid-50s, with wild white hair that hung down to his shoulders. He had deep crow's feet at the corners of his eyes and looked like he hadn't slept in days. His jeans were dusty and torn, shirt stained with paint. "You're early," he said. His voice was raspy, like someone who smoked too much or just didn't use his voice often. "I guess I made good time," I said. He nodded and motioned for me to follow him under the canopy. He laid out a series of sketches, architectural drawings, strange symbols, and explained what he wanted. "This piece is called Sunder," he said. "It's about separation, breaking down the human presence in nature. I need stills at sunrise and sunset, wide angles, no people, no context, just the desert swallowing the man-made." I liked the concept. We agreed I'd stay for 2 days. He let me camp in the back of his trailer on a tiny mattress wedged against a shelf of dusty books and old radios. He didn't talk much, just went back and forth from his tools to the structure, sometimes muttering to himself. At night, I sat outside watching the stars burn overhead. On the second night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a strange metallic sound, like dragging sheet metal across concrete. I assumed it was Everett, working on something, but when I peered out the window, I didn't see him anywhere. The desert was pitch black, the structure faintly silhouetted by the moonlight. Then I heard it again. Louder. Closer. I stepped out, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the dark, casting harsh shadows over the rocks and brush. The sound stopped. The wind was dead still. The air had an unnatural chill to it, and I noticed something odd. My flashlight kept flickering. Then in the distance, just past the installation, I saw something move. It wasn't Everett. It was too tall, and it wasn't walking. It was gliding. Silent. I called out, "Hey, who's there?" No answer. The figure paused and tilted its head. Its proportions were wrong. Its arms too long, spine too curved. I blinked, and it was gone. I backed into the trailer, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I told Everett what I saw. He didn't seem surprised. "There are things out here," he said, not looking at me. "Old things. You stay long enough, you feel them watching. At night, they walk." I laughed nervously, thinking maybe he was screwing with me, but he didn't smile. Later that day, I wandered behind the installation to photograph the rock formations. About half a mile out, I found what looked like an old, sunken foundation. Stone outlines of a small building, maybe a cabin or shed, long decayed. In the center of the foundation was a metal hatch, rusted shut. I tried to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. I went back and mentioned it to Everett. His face darkened. "That's from before," he said. "Before the mine was closed." I asked what mine, but he didn't answer. That night, I heard voices outside the trailer, whispers. They weren't in English, at least not any English I recognized. The voices were dry and guttural, like breath being forced through cracked pipes. I looked through the slit in the blinds and saw nothing, just emptiness and moonlight. Then something scraped against the trailer wall. Not wind, not an animal. Deliberate, slow. When I looked again, there was a smudge on the window, a handprint, but it was too big. The fingers too long. I stayed locked inside until dawn. The next morning, I told Everett I needed to leave early. He didn't argue. He just nodded and handed me a USB stick with all the project documentation. I packed up and drove off just as the sun broke over the horizon, but I didn't go far. Half an hour down the dirt road, the truck started to sputter. I checked the engine, nothing obviously wrong, but it wouldn't start. My phone had no signal, and I was at least 15 miles from the nearest paved road. That's when I saw the dust in my rearview mirror. Something or someone was coming. I grabbed my camera and binoculars and climbed onto the roof of the truck. What I saw chilled me. A figure, maybe 200 yards back, walking directly toward me. Not Everett. This thing moved slow but steady, arms swaying unnaturally. It was covered in a thin, pale cloth, almost like gauze, and its head twitched from side to side like it was sniffing. I shouted. It didn't respond. I waved my arms, but it didn't stop. I jumped down, grabbed a tire iron, and waited. But as it got closer, it veered slightly to the right, heading off into the desert. Then it vanished into the rock formations like it was never there. It took 3 hours before another vehicle came down the road, an old man in a beat-up van who gave me a ride into Quartzsite. I called a tow, but by the time we returned to the truck, it was gone, completely gone. No tire marks, no oil stains, no truck, just desert. The authorities filed it under theft and abandoned vehicle, but no one could explain how a 5,000-pound truck vanished without a trace from a dead-end road. I reached out to Everett after that. The number was disconnected. I sent emails. No reply. I returned to the coordinates a few months later out of curiosity. The structure? Gone. The trailer? Gone. Only the foundation I found was still there, and the metal hatch, still rusted shut, was now covered in claw marks. Deep ones. I tried to forget. I moved back to Portland, took a desk job, gave up field work altogether. But sometimes late at night, I still hear that dragging metal sound in my dreams. And once, not long ago, I found a handprint on the window of my apartment. It was too big. The fingers were too long. Story the end. It was July of 2015 when I took a road trip through the American Southwest, something I'd wanted to do for years. I'd been working as a freelance photographer in Los Angeles, and I'd hit a wall both professionally and personally. My long-term girlfriend had just moved out, and I hadn't booked a paid job in over a month. So I packed up my old Toyota 4Runner with camera gear, a cooler of food and water, a sleeping bag, and a plan to explore the forgotten corners of the desert, the kind of places you only see in postcards or old westerns. My route was loose. I planned to drive from LA through Joshua Tree, then swing east across Arizona toward Monument Valley. From there, maybe into New Mexico. I wasn't in a rush. I liked being alone, liked the silence and openness of the desert. It felt like the kind of place where you could hear yourself think again. The first few days went fine. I camped out under the stars near Kingman, Arizona. The days were blistering and the nights freezing, but the isolation was just what I needed. I took photos of old gas stations, broken down motels, and skeletal saguaro cacti casting long shadows in the evening sun. I even spent a night at a hot spring I stumbled across near some abandoned trailers. I felt like I was starting to clear my head. On the 5th day, I left the main road to explore a stretch of the Sonoran Desert I'd only seen on maps. There was a place I'd heard about through a hiker I met at a gas station. A dry riverbed that carved through a remote canyon, supposedly once used by native tribes and later by bootleggers. He said it was beautiful and totally empty, untouched, but that you had to take care navigating in and out because there were no marked roads. That sounded perfect to me. Solitude, silence, and hopefully some killer shots. I followed his directions as best I could. I turned off the main highway onto a dirt road called Copper Wash Trail, and from there drove another hour on a set of barely visible tire ruts that cut through the scrub. I passed a burned-out SUV, half buried in sand, with cactus growing through its open windows. That should have been the first sign. Eventually, the path narrowed to a rocky trail, then dropped into a wide dry wash framed by cliffs of rust-colored stone. There were no tire tracks anymore, just sand and silence. I figured I'd made it. I parked the 4Runner and set up camp, using some driftwood and a tarp for shade. That first night in the canyon, I made a fire and ate canned chili straight from the tin. I took a few long exposure shots of the cliffs under starlight, and it was so quiet I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Around midnight, the wind started. Not a gentle desert breeze, but a sudden gust that came howling through the canyon like a train. It shook my tarp loose and kicked sand into everything: my food, my sleeping bag, my camera bag. When the wind finally died down, I noticed something odd. There were tracks in the sand that hadn't been there before. Not animal tracks, human ones, barefoot, and not mine. They circled around my campsite in wide, deliberate arcs. At first, I told myself they must have been there all along and the wind just uncovered them. But as I followed the trail with my flashlight, I saw they continued down the canyon, weaving in and out of the moonlit scrub. I stood there for a while, heart pounding, listening for footsteps or breathing, anything. But there was only silence. The next day, I told myself I'd been imagining things. The heat, the isolation, it could mess with your head. I explored the canyon a bit, taking photos, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't see anyone, but I kept catching movement out of the corner of my eye, behind rocks, in the brush, just out of reach. Around noon, I climbed to a high outcrop to get a wide shot of the whole wash. That's when I saw something that made my stomach twist. On the far side of the canyon wall, maybe a quarter mile away, stood a figure. Tall, thin, not moving. Watching. I lifted my camera, zoomed in with the lens. The figure was wrapped in something, animal skins maybe, or rags. I couldn't see a face, just darkness under a hood or shadow. I blinked, and they were gone. I climbed down fast, heart hammering. I told myself again it was nothing. Maybe a shadow on the rocks, a cactus, but the footprints the night before didn't feel like nothing. I packed up my gear and decided I'd leave in the morning. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the back of my truck with the doors locked and windows cracked. Around 2 a.m. I heard something again, this time a slow, dragging sound outside, like feet shuffling through gravel. Then a sharp tapping on the rear window. Just once. I didn't move. I held my breath. Then nothing. Silence again. When morning came, I stepped out and walked a wide circle around the truck. The sand was disturbed. Prints again, bigger now, deeper, like whatever it was had been pressing down hard. That was enough. I threw my gear in the back, turned the key. Nothing. The engine clicked but wouldn't start. I tried again. Still nothing. I checked the battery. Connections looked fine. It had worked the day before. No warning signs. I tried my phone. No service. No signal at all. I sat there in the baking heat, trying not to panic. Eventually, I grabbed my water bottle and decided to hike out. I marked the truck on my GPS. The only thing still working, and headed back the way I came. The path wasn't clear, but I figured if I followed the sun west, I'd hit the road eventually. As I walked, the landscape began to feel strange. Wrong, somehow. Like I was circling the same rocks and cactus over and over. I checked the GPS again. It showed me walking in a straight line, but the horizon didn't change. The same dead Joshua tree. The same white boulder with a crack down the middle. It was like the desert itself was folding in on me. Around the 4th hour of walking, I saw the figure again. Far off this time, standing still. Then, closer, on the ridge. Then again, just ahead on the path, always too far to see clearly, always vanishing the second I looked directly. By sunset, I was hallucinating, or at least I thought I was. I saw shapes moving through the rocks, hunched, long-limbed things with empty eye sockets and fingers like claws. I stumbled and fell more than once. My water ran out. Then I saw firelight in the distance. A small camp just over the ridge. I ran toward it, calling out. As I crested the hill, I stopped cold. There was no camp, just a ring of stones, burnt wood in the middle, and something else, bones, small bones. Human, scattered, cracked open. I fell to my knees. That's when I noticed the carvings on the stones, crude symbols, circles with slashes through them, spirals, jagged lines that made my skin crawl. I turned to leave and saw the figure again, 10 feet away. Not human. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent the wrong way. The rags it wore seemed to move on their own, like breathing fabric. Where its face should have been was only shadow, deep, endless. It raised one hand, slow and deliberate, and pointed behind me. I turned. There was the Forerunner, right where I'd left it, except I had walked in a straight line for 10 hours. I ran to the truck, nearly sobbing, climbed in, turned the key. It started. The headlights flicked on, revealing nothing ahead but sand and road. I drove, didn't stop until I hit a gas station 70 miles away. I never went back. I never told anyone the full story until now. People wouldn't believe me. They'd say it was heat stroke or a breakdown, but I know what I saw. I know something is out there, watching, waiting. I still have the photos, not the ones I took during the day. Those are fine. I mean the nighttime shots. When I reviewed them weeks later on my laptop, I noticed something. In four of the frames, far in the background, just at the edge of the firelight, was a shape. Always the same. Tall. Still. Watching. I deleted the images, but sometimes when I drive past the edge of the desert, I swear I can still see it out there, just beyond the headlights. Story. The end. I've worked for the Bureau of Land Management for 15 years, mostly in the western states, but the incident that changed me happened during a summer assignment in southern Nevada. My team was dispatched to inspect an isolated stretch of federal bordering an old decommissioned missile testing site, about 70 miles northwest of Las Vegas. The area had long been off-limits due to safety concerns from the Cold War era, but now there were plans to open up portions of it for protected ecological study and limited public use. There were four of us: myself, Carrie, a field biologist, George, logistics, and Tomas, a survey tech. We were well equipped, driving two four-wheel drive trucks loaded with water, satellite radios, maps, and medical kits. We knew the terrain would be unforgiving, with temperatures topping 110 degrees during the day and plummeting at night. Still, we were seasoned. The desert didn't scare us. The plan was to spend 3 days camping on site, collecting environmental samples, mapping terrain, and logging any hazards. On the first morning, we drove out on an old military access road that was more sand and gravel than pavement. Our GPS showed we were approaching the edge of the old testing perimeter, a zone that had been fenced off decades ago, but was now little more than a faint line on outdated maps. I remember the silence most of all. The desert there had a weight to it, like a blanket of heat and history pressed down on you. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt peaceful. It was heavy, anxious, like the land itself was holding its breath. We made base camp near the base of a cracked ridge that looked like something from the moon. Jagged shale, pale red sand, and not a plant in sight. The only life we saw were lizards and a couple of vultures circling high above. That night, after logging our data and eating dehydrated meals, we sat in the warm dark, talking in low voices. The stars were impossibly clear. It should have been perfect. But I had this gnawing feeling that we weren't alone, not in a "there's someone in the bushes" way, more like the place itself was watching us. I didn't say anything at the time, didn't want to spook the team. Around 1 a.m., I woke up needing to pee. I stepped outside my tent, and everything was still. I mean, completely still. No breeze, no insect chirps, no sound from the tents. Even the usual distant hum of power lines or planes was absent. That's when I saw the lights. Small bluish-white glows, maybe 200 yards from camp. Not bright flashlights, more like dim lanterns. They moved slowly across the desert floor in a strange, coordinated pattern, like they were drifting just above the ground. I crouched behind a boulder and watched. My first thought was other people, maybe surveyors we hadn't known about. But they didn't move like people. There was no crunching of boots, no conversation, just the lights. Floating, swaying like reeds underwater. I went back into my tent and stayed awake the rest of the night. The next morning, I told the others. Carrie brushed it off, saying it could have been desert mirages or atmospheric effects. Tomas said maybe someone else had come into the area without registering. George didn't say anything. Then he mentioned real quiet, "I saw them too, 2 nights ago. Thought it was a dream." That shook me. We decided to finish up the second day early and move camp further east, away from the ridge and the lights. But before we could pack up, Tomas came running toward us from the ridge. He'd been checking soil samples near the edge and looked shaken. "You guys need to see this," he said, panting. We followed him to a shallow depression about half a mile out. At first, it looked like a crater, perfectly circular, maybe 30 feet across and 6 feet deep. The weird part was the interior. The sand inside was blackened and smooth like glass, as if it had been melted. There was no record of test detonations in that section and no recent impact events we knew of. Tomas pointed to a series of narrow indentations along the edge. Tracks. But not like any animal I'd seen. They were long, narrow slits, spaced unevenly as if something dragged itself around the perimeter. Carrie was clearly uneasy. "Could be leftover military experiments," she offered without confidence. We didn't linger. That night, we moved east and set up in a low basin behind a hill. We didn't even bother unpacking the cooking gear. Everyone was tense. Around midnight, we heard something moving. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal. It was dragging. A long, scraping sound across hard-packed dirt and scattered stones, followed by a pause, then another drag. Closer. We froze inside our tents. I heard Tomas quietly unzip his sleeping bag and reach for his headlamp, but no one dared turn on a light. The dragging passed within 20 feet of camp, and then a sound I can only describe as breathing. Slow, wheezing breaths like someone with fluid in their lungs. They continued for several minutes before fading away. We didn't sleep. At dawn, we found more of the long, narrow tracks around camp, trails in the sand leading nowhere, disappearing abruptly as if the thing had simply stopped existing. We packed up. No one argued. George suggested cutting the trip short, and everyone agreed without hesitation. We radioed our base station and told them we were heading back a day early. It would take several hours to reach the highway, so we made good time, avoiding the ridge and crater entirely. But about an hour into the drive, the GPS cut out, then the satellite phone. George and I were in the lead truck. He kept smacking the GPS screen, but it showed only static. We switched to paper maps and compass, which added time. Then, over the radio, Carrie's voice crackled. "Stop! Something's wrong with Tomas." We pulled over on a dry wash and ran back to the second truck. Tomas was curled in the passenger seat, shivering despite the 100-degree heat. His pupils were dilated, his face pale and clammy. "He said something touched him last night," Carrie said. "He thought it was one of us. We tried to cool him with wet towels and shade, but he kept muttering. 'They're in the sand,' he kept repeating. 'They're underneath.'" We loaded him into our truck and pushed hard for the main road. It took us 5 more hours, most of it in silence. Every mile felt like 100. By the time we reached the hospital in Pahrump, Tomas was unresponsive. The ER said he was severely dehydrated, but also in some kind of catatonic shock. No clear cause. He stayed that way for 3 days. Then he woke up, but he wouldn't talk. Not to us. Not to the doctors. Just stared blankly at walls or curled into himself in bed. His family flew in from Texas and transferred him to a psychiatric center. I haven't seen him since. George resigned 2 months later, said he couldn't work in the field anymore. Carrie requested permanent office duty. We haven't spoken in years. As for me, I filed the report, left out the strange details. I stayed with the Bureau, but never returned to that region. Something was wrong with that land. I don't know if it was something buried, something waiting, or something that doesn't want us there. A few weeks after the incident, I got a letter. No return address. No signature. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Typed in, all caps, were the words, "They were not done testing." I still keep it in a locked box, not because I need a reminder, but because part of me believes it wasn't a warning. It was a threat. And if you ever find yourself out in the Nevada desert and you see lights where there shouldn't be lights, don't follow them. Don't even look too long. Just leave. Story the end. I wasn't planning on dying in the desert. That kind of thing only happened to people who didn't prepare. People who underestimated the land, didn't bring enough water, didn't check the weather, didn't know how to read a map. I wasn't one of them. Or so I thought. In August of 2019, I set off on a solo expedition into the Black Rock Desert in Nevada. I had grown tired of my cramped apartment in Oakland, the incessant hum of traffic, the people pressing in on all sides. I craved open space, quiet. I wanted to feel something ancient, something unspoiled. I'd been out to the Black Rock before, once during a geology internship years ago and once more during Burning Man, though I stayed mostly on the edge of that chaos. But this time would be different. This time I was going alone, really alone. My plan was simple. Spend 5 days camping, hiking, and photographing the more remote areas near the northwest edge of the playa, a part most tourists and festival goers never bothered to see. I had maps, satellite GPS, 2 backup batteries, a small solar charger, and enough food and water to last 7 days. I kept my permits in a folder on the dashboard, and I let my brother know exactly where I was going. Every box was checked. I left early in the morning, made the long drive past Gerlach, and arrived at the edge of the desert as the sun was dipping low. The dust rose behind my Subaru Outback like smoke from a fuse. I parked near a rock outcropping and set up camp. Tent, table, small fire pit, the works. It was dead silent. No bugs, no birds, just wind. That first night was almost surreal. The stars came out in layers, endless and sharp. The Milky Way looked close enough to reach into. I sat in my camp chair, sipping warm coffee from a thermos and thinking how right I'd been to do this. No distractions, no one to impress, no obligations. Just me and the desert. The second day, I hiked about 7 miles northeast, following a line of volcanic rock that stretched like a jagged scar across the flat. I came across an old mining shack, a rusted tin structure barely holding together, half swallowed by sand. It wasn't on any map I had, which I found odd. Inside, there wasn't much. Some broken glass bottles, rotted wood, a collapsed cot, and on the far wall, scratched deep into the paneling, was a crude drawing. It was a circle with lines coming off it like rays, but at the end of each ray were small slashes, vertical, like tally marks. There were dozens. I thought it might have been a sun symbol or something ritualistic, but it unsettled me. I took a picture of it and left quickly. That night, something woke me up. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like a shift. The air felt heavier, thicker. I sat up in my tent, unzipped the flap, and listened. Nothing. The wind had stopped. Total silence. My phone screen read 3:14 a.m. I looked around outside but saw nothing. No animals, no movement. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. On the third day, I hiked west toward a cluster of low hills, maybe a 10-mile round trip. The sun was vicious. Even with my long-sleeved shirt, hat, and SPF 50, my skin stung. Around noon, I spotted something in the distance. At first, I thought it was a mirage, a shimmer, but as I approached, it became clear. A stone circle. Man-made. 15 or 20 large stones, each standing a few feet tall, placed in a nearly perfect ring. In the center was another symbol etched into the ground, filled with black ash, or maybe charcoal. It looked almost identical to the symbol I'd seen scratched in the mining shack. I felt a chill creep down my spine despite the heat. Something about the symmetry, the silence. It didn't feel like just a curiosity. I took a few photos, made some notes, then started back toward camp. That's when I realized I hadn't heard a single plane, bird, or insect all day. Not even the wind. When I got back, my tent had collapsed. Not torn, not broken, just crumpled like someone had let the air out. The pegs were all still in place. Nothing was missing. It looked almost intentional. I stood there for several minutes, scanning the desert. No footprints, no tire tracks, just endless, flat dust. I rebuilt the tent quickly and tried to tell myself it was nothing. Wind, maybe? The ground's soft, after all. Maybe one peg slipped and the rest just gave way. That night, I woke again, same time, nearly down to the minute. But this time, I wasn't alone. I heard something outside the tent. Footsteps. Not animals. Slow, deliberate, two-footed steps. They circled the tent once, then again. I reached for my flashlight, but it was dead. I had changed the batteries 2 days ago. I grabbed my backup, also dead. I sat frozen for what felt like hours, heart hammering, every nerve alert. The steps stopped. No sound. When morning came, I stumbled out, exhausted. No prints, no sign of anything. I was starting to feel like I was going insane. I packed my gear and decided I'd had enough. I'd leave a day early, get back to civilization, sleep in a real bed. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the car didn't start. Battery was fine, engine wouldn't even click. I checked the hood, everything looked normal. Fuel gauge read half a tank. I tried again, nothing. I opened the back to get my radio and satellite beacon. The radio screen wouldn't turn on. The beacon blinked red, a signal error I'd never seen before. The desert had gone silent again. I tried walking south toward the main trail. My GPS flickered on, then shut off. I pulled out my map and compass, but the horizon was playing tricks. Landmarks I thought I knew didn't look right. The hills were wrong, nothing matched. I turned in a slow circle and realized I didn't know which direction camp was anymore. It was gone. Just gone. I wasn't just lost, I was somewhere else entirely. I walked for hours, the sun beat down like a curse. My skin peeled, lips cracked, throat dried out. Eventually, I collapsed in the shade of a rock formation and passed out. When I woke up, it was near sunset. The sky had a strange tinge, like it had been dusted with ash. I could hear footsteps again, but now they were closer, not behind me, beside me. I turned and saw someone, standing on the ridge. Tall, still, watching. It didn't move. I blinked, and it was gone. I screamed until my throat gave out. That night, I didn't sleep. The figures came again. This time, there were more of them. always just at the edge of the firelight. They stood in a circle, silent, unmoving. I was back in the center of that stone ring. I don't remember how I got there. I ran, no sense of direction, no goal, just sheer terror pushing me forward. Eventually, I collapsed again. When I woke up, it was to the sound of an engine, a real engine. A BLM survey truck found me curled beneath a mesquite shrub, sunburned to the point of blistering, dehydrated, disoriented, and barely conscious. They airlifted me out. I spent 2 days in the hospital. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. When I asked if they recovered my vehicle or gear, they said they found nothing. No sign of a campsite, no tracks, no vehicle. They searched with aerial drones. There was nothing. I tried to show them the photos on my phone. The symbol, the stone circle. My phone was blank, not just deleted, reset, factory default. No images, no notes, no record I'd even been out there. When I got home, I looked up that mining shack I found. No record of it. The symbol? I tried searching anthropology journals, native art, even esoteric forums. Nothing. It doesn't exist. I stopped sleeping through the night. I kept waking up at 3:14 a.m. every single night. No noise, no dreams. Just a pressure, like something just outside the walls. Listening. Watching. Last week I found a small circle of stones outside my apartment. I live on the 3rd floor. Story the end. The desert isn't a place that reveals its true nature quickly. It creeps up on you, quiet and patient, until you're already tangled in it, unable to tell where the land ends and your own fears begin. I learned that the hard way. I'm Greg, a geologist based out of Phoenix, Arizona. I've spent my career mapping fault lines, sampling rock layers, and teaching undergrads about sedimentary basins. Normally, I'm more comfortable behind a microscope than under an open sky, but this job was different. The company I worked for contracted me to survey a remote stretch of desert near the border of Arizona and New Mexico, an area known as the Peloncillo Mountains, notorious for its rugged terrain and sparse population. The job was straightforward. Gather soil samples, record GPS coordinates, and check for any signs of seismic activity. The client wanted a detailed report on the area's stability before building a new highway through it. They warned us about the heat and limited cell service, but otherwise the area was considered low risk. I went out with my colleague, Mark, a tough, no-nonsense guy who'd been in the field far longer than me. We set out in early June, just before the heat wave started. Our plan was to camp near the base of the mountains, about 20 miles from the nearest town, and cover as much ground as possible over 5 days. The first day was uneventful. The sun was brutal but manageable with plenty of water and shade. We took soil samples, marked out a few coordinates, and talked about the upcoming weekend plans. As we set up camp near a dry creek bed, the sky exploded with stars, and the cool night air was a relief. On the second day, we decided to explore a ridge farther east. The terrain got steeper and rougher, with loose shale underfoot and jagged rock formations rising like broken teeth. As we climbed higher, Mark spotted a strange pattern in the rock walls, petroglyphs, ancient weathered symbols etched deep into the stone, spirals, animals, humanoid figures with elongated limbs. They looked Navajo, but unfamiliar. "Looks like no one's been here for a while," Mark said, tracing a spiral with his finger. We took photos and marked the location. I felt an odd chill, despite the heat. Something about those symbols felt wrong. Like they weren't just art, but warnings. That night, around the campfire, Mark joked about desert spirits and curses. I laughed, but couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The third day was when things began to unravel. We moved farther into the mountains, deeper into the wilderness. The heat was oppressive, and the air dry enough to crack lips in minutes. Around midday, we reached a small clearing with a shallow pit in the center. It looked natural at first, but closer inspection revealed the walls were too smooth, almost carved. The pit was about 8 feet wide and at least 10 feet deep. No bottom in sight. Mark dropped a rock, but we never heard it hit the bottom. We debated whether to climb down, but decided against it. There was no safety gear, and the darkness was complete. As we prepared to leave, the wind shifted. It carried whispers, barely audible at first, like voices carried on the breeze. I stopped, straining to listen. "Did you hear that?" I asked Mark. He nodded but said nothing. That night, the wind came back, stronger, swirling around our tents with a low moan. I couldn't sleep. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. Words in a language I didn't recognize. The voices seemed to circle the camp, rising and falling like waves. Suddenly, a sharp crack outside my tent made me jump. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the flap. The desert was empty. But just beyond the firelight, shadows danced, too tall, too thin to be animals. Mark was gone. I called for him until my voice broke. No answer. The next morning, I found footprints circling our camp, barefoot, large, and oddly elongated. They led toward the pit. I wanted to leave immediately, but my truck wouldn't start. The battery was dead. I was stranded. The following days were a blur of fear and confusion. The whispers never stopped. Shadows lingered at the edge of vision. My supplies dwindled. I tried climbing down the pit to find Mark, but was stopped by an overwhelming darkness that seemed to press against me, suffocating and cold. On the 5th day, I stumbled across Mark's jacket near the pit's edge. It was torn and stained with dried blood. I screamed for him again. No response. Finally, on the 6th day, a search party found me, weak, dehydrated, and babbling about voices and shadows. They found no sign of Mark or the pit. They called it hallucinations from heat stroke. I know better. Sometimes when the wind blows just right, I hear those whispers, and I know the desert is still watching. Story the end. I was 32 the summer I decided to cross the Mojave alone. It wasn't a spiritual thing or some attempt at healing after trauma. I wasn't trying to find myself. I just wanted to get away. I had time off work and the urge to see the desert in its rawest form. I had always been drawn to remote places, the ones where the radio goes silent, where the night swallows everything. I'd taken solo road trips before, but this was different. I planned a route off the main highways, going through dirt roads, unmarked trails, and long-forgotten service paths between ghost towns and abandoned outposts. I told people where I was going. My brother, mainly. I sent him GPS pins, shared the map, told him if he didn't hear from me in 4 days to start calling around. He thought I was nuts, but not enough to argue. I loaded up my old 1998 4Runner, packed gallons of water, fuel, a tent, a shortwave radio, and my camera gear. I had read enough horror stories to respect the desert, what it could do to someone careless. My first day out was uneventful. I left Needles and worked my way northeast along an old mining road. I passed maybe 2 people the entire day, both in ATVs, both too sunburned to talk. I camped just outside an old prospector's camp, what remained of it anyway. A few rotting planks, a crumbled chimney, and an old rusted shovel jammed into the dirt like someone left in a hurry. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that only the desert can give you. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and listened to the wind howl through the brush. That first night I slept better than I had in weeks. Something about being that far from everything gave my mind space to breathe. I woke before sunrise, made coffee, and started toward an abandoned town site I had marked on my map. I'd seen satellite images of it online. Just a few structures, an old bar, a service garage, a couple of homes with sun-collapsed roofs. It was the perfect spot to explore for a few hours, get some shots, maybe find something cool left behind. It took me 3 hours to get there on rough dirt roads. My suspension groaned the whole time. There were no tire tracks ahead of me, just mine. The kind of place people stopped caring about 100 years ago. When I arrived, I saw what I expected. The structures were dead and tired. The heat was already brutal, like though it wasn't yet noon. I parked in the shade of what used to be a post office and started walking around with my camera. Everything was quiet. No birds, no insects, no breeze. It felt like I was underwater. That was the first moment I started to feel something was off. Not dangerous, not yet, but off, like I was being watched. I brushed it off, kept exploring. Inside the bar, the floorboards were warped and broken, and the ceiling had mostly caved in. The back room smelled faintly of oil and something more sour. I found a dusty, half-full bottle of wild turkey on a shelf behind the collapsed counter, probably left by some curious drifter. In the garage, old tools hung from nails on the wall. A cracked photo of a man and a woman, maybe husband and wife, was pinned above a workbench. Both of them smiling, eyes squinting against the sun. I walked down the dirt path between 2 collapsed homes and found something strange. A door standing upright in the sand. Just a door. No frame, no walls, no hinges, just a single weather-beaten door planted vertically like a tombstone. Behind it, open desert. Nothing else. I walked around it, snapped a photo, but didn't touch it. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong. After a few hours, I returned to my truck, ate a protein bar, and poured water on my head to cool down. I looked at the map. The next site I wanted to check out was about 25 miles away, due east, but the terrain was rough. I debated heading there now or saving it for the next morning. I didn't want to drive at night, not out here. But I also didn't want to stay here. There was something about that place. That door. Around 2 p.m., I decided to go for it. I'd make it work. I had enough fuel and daylight. I drove east on a narrow trail for about 30 minutes when the engine coughed. Then again, a minute later, the RPMs dropped and I lost power. I let the truck roll to a stop, put it in park, and popped the hood. The engine was hot, too hot, but I'd been keeping an eye on the temp gauge. Nothing had flagged. I let it cool while I checked the fluids. Oil was fine, coolant was where it should be. Nothing obvious. Then I tried the radio. Static. I had reception that morning. Now nothing. I waited another 30 minutes, then tried to crank it. Nothing but a sputter. Another try. Same result. Then the battery light blinked. Then, nothing. I sat back in the seat, listening to the heat tick off the engine. I wasn't in full panic mode yet. I had water, shelter, even a satellite beacon in case of real trouble. I figured I'd wait out the sun and hike back to the ghost town, maybe spend another night there and reassess. The old radio tower nearby might help me catch a signal. I set up my emergency tarp for shade, drank some water, and tried to relax. That was when I saw the footprints. I don't know how I missed them before. They were maybe 30 feet from where I'd stopped. Deep in the sand, leading from the brush toward the road, then circling around the front of my truck. Bare feet, long strides, no shoes. The prints looked fresh, edges sharp and undisturbed by wind. They stopped at the back of the truck. I stood slowly, scanning the horizon. Nothing but heat shimmer. I called out. "Hello?" My voice sounded too loud. No answer. I followed the prints backward, maybe 30 or 40 feet, before they vanished into hard-packed earth. I crouched and looked closer. The last print was deeper than the rest, like whoever made it had pushed off into a run. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed in the truck with the windows cracked and my flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. At some point, I heard something moving around outside, soft steps on sand, too heavy to be a rabbit or coyote. I shone the light but saw nothing. Around 3 a.m., the temperature dropped sharply, more than it should have. I was shivering despite the blanket. Then I heard breathing, just outside the driver's side window, slow, steady breathing. I turned and saw a shadow there, tall, unmoving. I couldn't make out a face, just the silhouette. I shouted and slammed my hand against the door. When I turned on the high beams, there was nothing. No prints, no movement, just empty desert. When morning came, I tried the engine again. Nothing. I packed up water and supplies, marked the truck's location on my GPS, and started walking back west toward the ghost town. It took me 4 hours. When I arrived, everything looked different. The door was gone, not knocked down, gone. No marks in the sand where it stood, no hinge, no shadow, just a faint rectangular discoloration where the sun hadn't touched the ground beneath it for years. I checked the buildings again. Inside the bar, the photo behind the counter was different. Same man, but the woman was missing. Her side of the frame was blank. I backed out slowly and made my way to the garage. The tools were gone, the walls bare. I left. I walked another 5 miles until I finally picked up a weak cell signal near an old radio mast and called my brother. He arranged for a tow and sent GPS coordinates to a recovery service. Took them another 2 days to find my truck. They said it was out of gas, but I know I had a quarter tank left. I checked it myself. The mechanic couldn't explain the sudden battery drain either. Said it was like the truck had just shut down on its own. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. Not really. Sometimes I try to believe I imagined it all. That the sun got to me. That isolation played tricks. But I know what I saw. And I never found the photos I took of that town. My camera card was corrupted, every file unreadable. But the photo of the man and woman from the bar, that was still on my phone. Only now it's just him, standing alone in front of that crumbled building, smiling. Story the end. It was the spring of 2018 when I took a solo trip through the Mojave Desert. I had just turned 30, recently divorced, and feeling like I needed something drastic to clear my head. I've always loved the desert. Its emptiness, its stillness, Something about how time seems to slow down out there gave me comfort. I packed up my old Toyota Tacoma, filled the back with camping gear, extra water, a solar charger, and headed out from Barstow. I had no set route, just a few GPS coordinates of abandoned towns and forgotten trails I wanted to explore. On the second night, I set up camp near a dry wash not far from Amboy. The sun was just starting to dip when I noticed the first odd thing. I had parked near a cluster of rocks that jutted up from the sand like crooked teeth. While collecting wood, I spotted a formation, what looked like a crude stone circle, half buried in the dirt. It wasn't large, maybe 4 feet across, but it looked intentional. The stones were stacked with care, symmetrical and old. I figured maybe it was an old fire ring or a marker of some sort, but the way the center was cleared, perfectly smooth and free of debris, gave me pause. Still, I didn't think too much about it. Weird things get left in the desert all the time. That night, the wind howled hard. The Mojave wind isn't a breeze. It's sharp, angry, and unrelenting. I stayed zipped in my tent, listening to it rip through the wash like it was searching for something. Around 2 a.m., I woke up with an overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. There was no wind anymore. Total silence. Even in the desert, you usually hear something, distant coyotes, shifting sand, insects, but this was a vacuum. Then I heard the faintest crunch of sand outside my tent. Just one step. I held my breath. Another crunch. It wasn't close, maybe 20 feet off, but it was deliberate. Something or someone was walking out there. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. I didn't unzip the tent, not at first. I just sat there with the beam pointed at the flap, listening. The crunching didn't continue. It was like whoever or whatever was out there knew I was awake now. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the flap and shined the light out into the darkness. Nothing. Just the flat, empty expanse of sand and rock. My fire ring had long gone cold. My truck was right where I left it. No tracks in the sand. I got out, shivering from a mix of cold and adrenaline. I did a full sweep around the tent. Nothing. Not a sound. Not a footprint. I told myself it was probably a jackrabbit or a coyote. I knew that was bullshit, but I had to sleep somehow. The next morning, I packed up and left that wash behind. I drove about 50 miles east near a place called Crucero. It's nothing now, just a smattering of collapsed wood structures and rusted-out cars slowly being eaten by the desert. I hiked a few miles off the highway and found an old road that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. It led to what must have once been a homestead, just a single wooden structure with half a roof and a shed leaning so hard it looked ready to fall at the touch of wind. Inside the main house were the remnants of someone's life. Broken dishes, an old iron stove, a mildewed mattress, and photographs pinned to the wall. Black and white, faces worn away by sun and time. One of the photos caught my eye. It showed a man and a woman standing in front of the house. This house, decades ago. In the corner of the picture, almost out of frame, was a stone circle, identical to the one I saw the night before. I looked at it for a long time. It gave me a strange feeling, like recognition or warning. I stayed there that night, sleeping in my truck with the windows cracked. Around 1 a.m., I woke to a distant banging. At first, I thought it was something flapping in the wind, but when I sat up and listened, I realized it was rhythmic. Bang, bang, pause, bang. Like someone was knocking, slow and patient. It wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from the shed. I locked the truck doors and stayed put until morning. When the sun finally came up, I got out and checked the shed. The door was shut tight, the old latch rusted into place. I pushed it open. Inside was nothing, just empty tools, some scrap metal, a broken cot. But on the floor was a circle, another one, this time drawn into the dust with what looked like bone fragments piled at the center. I left. Fast. I decided then to head back toward civilization. I was near the Kelso Dunes by then, and figured I could camp one last night before hitting I-40 the next day. I drove until I was out of sight of anything man-made, then parked in a dip between two rocky outcrops. As the sun set, I felt this pressure building in my chest. Not fear exactly, but a weight, like something was hanging in the air, just waiting. I built a fire and stayed close to it, watching the shadows grow long and strange. Around midnight, I heard it again, the crunch of sand. This time it was closer. I stood and swung my flashlight in the direction of the sound. Just beyond the circle of light was a figure. I froze. The shape was tall, unmoving. I could barely make out details, but it didn't look right. Its limbs were too long. The arms hung lower than they should. It didn't wear clothes, just this dark skin that almost shimmered under the moonlight. It didn't move. I shouted at it. "Hey! Who's there?" Nothing. Then it turned. Not walked, turned, pivoted, and slipped behind a boulder with impossible speed. I ran to my truck and stayed there the rest of the night, engine off, hand wrapped around the handle of a rusted tire iron. Come dawn, I stepped out, scanned the area. No footprints, no sign anyone had been there. Except now, behind my truck, etched into the sand, was another stone circle. Perfect, pristine. At the center was the charred skull of what looked like a small animal. That was it. I peeled out of there and didn't stop until I reached a diner near Ludlow. I must have looked like hell, dusty, wide-eyed, hands shaking, because the waitress poured me coffee without saying a word. After I told her what I saw, she didn't laugh. She didn't even seem surprised. Instead, she said, "You shouldn't go poking around where the old ones walked." She told me stories about settlers who vanished, prospectors who lost their minds, old tribes that warned against traveling the desert alone. Said there were places in the Mojave where time doesn't work right, where things live beneath the sand, things older than memory. She said the circles are invitations. Once you see them, they see you back. I don't camp in the desert anymore. Hell, I barely leave the city now. Sometimes I still wake up to that sound, sand crunching just outside the window. And once, just once, I found a small stone on my doorstep, perfectly smooth and unnaturally warm to the touch. Story the end. The desert stretches out endless and unforgiving, and no matter how many times you think you know it, it always has a way of reminding you who really rules there. I learned this the hard way during a summer job in the Mojave Desert in 2016. I've spent years working in environmental field research, mostly in national parks and remote areas, but nothing prepared me for what happened that July. I was hired by a private ecological consulting firm contracted by a government agency to survey an old military bombing range near an isolated area west of Barstow, California. The range was shut down in the early 90s, but it still had hazards like unexploded ordnance and toxic waste pockets. The job was straightforward: collect soil samples, map flora and fauna, check for contamination signs. My crew was 3 people: me, Sarah, a field biologist, Mike, the driver and safety officer, and Carlos, a junior technician. We arrived midday, following a long dirt road off Route 66, passing stretches of creosote bush and Joshua trees. The sun was blazing at over 110 degrees. We set up camp near the remains of an old observation bunker, a concrete slab cracked and half buried in the sand. The nearest town was at least 40 miles away, and cell reception was non-existent. The first couple of days were uneventful. Typical desert fieldwork, baking in the sun, careful navigation around fenced-off danger zones. But by the third evening, things started to get strange. It began with the silence. I know it sounds odd because deserts are usually silent, but this silence was different, unnatural. No insects, no birds, no wind. Even the usual distant hum of desert creatures was gone, as if the whole place was holding its breath. I noticed it first while walking to the water truck after dinner. The sky was a deep indigo, stars sharp and bright overhead. I glanced toward the ridgeline east of camp and thought I saw flickering lights. At first, I figured it was the campfire of another group, but I was certain no one else was allowed here. The next night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on my cot inside the tent, listening. At around 2 a.m., I heard the faintest crunch of footsteps in the sand, soft and deliberate, circling the camp perimeter. I grabbed my flashlight and zipped open the tent flap, but saw nothing. The moon was low, and the sand dunes stretched out, dark and empty. "Guys," I whispered. No response. When I shined my light toward the rocky outcrop nearby, I saw nothing but shadows. The footsteps stopped. By the 4th day, all of us were on edge. Mike and Carlos both mentioned hearing whispering voices that vanished when they tried to locate them. Sarah said she spotted strange symbols etched into some rocks near the northern boundary, jagged lines arranged in a circle. She took photos, but refused to go near them again. On the last night of our survey, we set up camp slightly closer to the ridge for better coverage. The temperature dropped rapidly after sunset. We sat around the fire, trying to keep spirits up, but none of us really wanted to talk about what we'd heard or seen. At about midnight, a strange sound echoed across the desert, a low, guttural chant, almost melodic, but utterly alien. It started faint, like the wind carrying voices, but grew louder. The voices were neither male nor female, but a chorus of many, overlapping. I stood up, heart pounding. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked. They nodded, frozen. From the darkness came a flicker, bluish, ethereal light dancing across the sand in slow, shifting patterns. It wasn't fire, not quite electricity. The air around the glow shimmered, distorting like heat waves. Then, from the edge of the ridge, figures emerged. Tall, thin, humanoid shapes cloaked in ragged garments that seemed to ripple and blur. Their faces were hidden beneath deep hoods, but their eyes glowed faintly, cold and endless. We froze, the firelight flickering across the cracked earth. They moved silently, sliding across the sand like shadows. One stepped forward, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. My limbs went numb, and my mind screamed to run, but I couldn't. Suddenly, the chanting stopped. The figures vanished. In the silence that followed, we scrambled into our tents, locking zippers and shoving chairs against doors. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, heart hammering, listening for footsteps or voices. At first light, we packed as fast as we could and headed back down the dirt road. As we drove, the desert seemed to watch us, the sun burning holes through the cracked windshield. We didn't stop until we reached the highway and cell signal. Days later, when I examined Sarah's photos of the symbols, I noticed something disturbing. The jagged lines weren't just random scratches. They resembled ancient sigils used by desert tribes long gone, but twisted, corrupted somehow. Some patterns seemed to pulse or shift when stared at too long. I never returned to that place, and none of us spoke of it again except in hushed whispers. The desert isn't empty, it's alive, and some things waiting there never want visitors. Story the end. The sun was just beginning to bake the horizon when I pulled off Interstate 40 and onto a narrow dirt road winding into the Mojave Desert. My name is Daniel, and I'd been hired to repair some old telecom equipment at a remote relay station that a few companies still use to patch coverage through the emptiness of Southern California's desert. It was late May 2019, and the heat was already oppressive, the kind that melts the air and makes your skin itch. I drove my beat-up Ford Ranger as far as I could before the road gave out and switched to hiking on foot. The station was about 3 miles ahead, set up near an old mining outpost, abandoned decades ago. The company didn't send anyone with me, just my orders, a toolkit, and enough water for 2 days. That first afternoon, I fixed the antenna mast and replaced a few cables. I had no cell service, but carried a satellite phone in case of emergencies. The desert was eerily quiet, save for the occasional cry of a raven or the skittering of lizards under rocks. I camped near the station, eating canned beans under a sky painted with stars. The temperature dropped sharply at night, and the silence was absolute. No cars, no planes, no signs of civilization. Around midnight, I woke up to a distant rustling sound, like footsteps crunching on gravel. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness, but saw nothing. The wind had picked up, shifting sand into small dust devils that circled near my tent. The next morning, I found footprints around the station, large, human-like, but with toes that spread wide and long nails that dug into the dirt. I'd never seen prints like them before, not from any animal or human. That afternoon, while checking power lines, I glimpsed something moving beyond a ridge, a shadow, tall and thin, vanishing behind a rock outcrop. When I called out, silence answered. As night fell, the station's old radio crackled with static. Then a faint voice, speaking in a language I didn't understand. The voice grew louder, more urgent, until it seemed to echo all around me. I tried to sleep, but the whispering didn't stop. I felt eyes on me, watching from every shadow. The heat of the day was replaced by an unbearable cold that seeped into my bones. I thought about leaving, but the truck was parked miles away, and my water was running low. On the third day, I packed up, intent on hiking back to the main road. But the landscape had changed. The familiar rocks and cacti twisted into grotesque shapes, the horizon bending unnaturally. No matter how far I walked, the same ridge appeared before me. As dusk approached, I saw the shadow again, closer this time. It didn't move, but stared with hollow eyes. My heart pounded as I backed away, but the ground beneath me shifted like quicksand. I stumbled, falling into darkness. I awoke hours later in my truck, engine running, the desert sun rising. There was no sign of the station or the footprints. I drove away, never looking back. Sometimes late at night, my radio still crackles with whispers calling me back to the desert. Story the end.